The classroom fell silent as the professor smirked. Your mother? An intelligent woman? Please. The students chuckled, except one. Barron Trump's jaw clenched. He could let it slide, or he could stand up. What did he do next? Left the entire room stunned. Stay till the end, his response will shock you. The Grand Lecture Hall of Columbia University hummed with quiet anticipation. Hundreds of students filled the rows of wooden seats, their eyes fixed on the front of the room, where Professor Daniel Wright, a well-respected but notoriously sharp-tongued political science professor, was about to begin his lecture. The air smelled of old books and fresh coffee, a signature scent of academia. The high, arched windows let in beams of pale afternoon sunlight, casting long shadows across the polished mahogany floor. In the middle row sat Barron Trump, tall and composed, his hands resting lightly on the desk. At 18 years old, he had inherited his mother's quiet grace and his father's commanding presence. Unlike many of his peers, he preferred to keep a low profile, focusing on his studies rather than the media frenzy that always seemed to swirl around his last name. Despite the privilege his family name carried, Barron had never leaned on it for special treatment. He was intelligent, reserved, and introspective, a young man who had spent years trying to carve out his own identity in a world that had already decided who he was supposed to be. The students murmured as Professor Wright approached the podium. He was a man known for his sharp wit and controversial statements, unafraid to challenge the powerful. Today, however, he was about to cross a line no one expected. Let's talk about the influence of First Ladies on American politics, Wright began, adjusting his glasses. Some have been visionaries, like Eleanor Roosevelt or Michelle Obama. Others, well, let's just say, their biggest contribution was looking good in expensive dresses. A ripple of nervous laughter ran through the room. Barron's grip on his pen tightened. Professor Wright smirked, knowing he had the students' attention. Then, in a tone laced with condescension, he added, take Melania Trump, for example. A woman who struggled to form complete sentences in English, yet somehow found herself in the White House. Quite the American dream, isn't it? The room fell silent. Some students exchanged awkward glances, unsure whether to laugh or cringe. Barron's jaw tensed. He could feel the heat rising in his chest, the weight of every unspoken defense pressing against his ribs. He could have let it slide. He could have ignored it, just like he had ignored the countless jabs at his family over the years. But today was different. With measured composure, Barron rose from his seat. And then, in a voice that sent chills through the lecture hall, he spoke. A hush fell over the lecture hall as Barron Trump stood, his imposing height making him tower over the seated students. All eyes turned toward him, some in curiosity, others in apprehension. He was not one to seek attention, but something in the professor's words had struck a nerve. A line had been crossed. For years, Barron had heard the jokes, the mockery, the dismissive comments about his mother. He had learned to ignore them, to push past the noise. But today, standing in a room filled with bright minds, the future leaders, thinkers, and policymakers, he realized something unsettling. If his own professor, an educator entrusted with shaping young minds, could demean someone simply because of their accent, their background, what message did that send to every immigrant, every foreign-born student in that room? The weight of silence pressed down on him. Professor Wright raised an eyebrow, clearly amused. Something you'd like to add, Mr. Trump? He asked, folding his arms. His tone was laced with the same smug superiority that had fueled his insult. Barron inhaled slowly, steadying himself. Then, in a voice calm but firm, he spoke. With all due respect, Professor Wright, your statement is not only inaccurate, it's unworthy of an educator. A murmur rippled through the room. Some students shifted in their seats. A few pulled out their phones, sensing something viral-worthy unfolding before them. Professor Wright chuckled. Unworthy? Mr. Trump, I was merely making an observation. Your mother was a model, not a stateswoman. Her contributions to policy discussions were limited at best. Barron's blue eyes locked onto the professor's. His next words were measured, deliberate. Do you speak 5 languages, Professor? Wright blinked. Excuse me? My mother does. Slovenian, French, German, Italian, and English. She arrived in this country without privilege, without connections, and she built a life through discipline and determination. She became a successful businesswoman, a U.S. citizen, and the First Lady of the United States. You may disagree with her politics, but to mock her intelligence? That's not an observation. That's arrogance. The air in the room turned electric. Some students exchanged glances, their expressions shifting from amusement to contemplation. A few even nodded subtly, as if reassessing their own assumptions. Professor Wright's smirk faltered, but only for a second. He had spent years perfecting the art of verbal sparring, and he wasn't about to let an 18-year-old best him in his own classroom. An interesting defense, Mr. Trump. But let's be honest, her role was largely ceremonial. She was no Eleanor Roosevelt or Hillary Clinton. Barron took a step forward, his presence commanding. He was no longer just defending his mother. He was standing up for something greater. Not every First Lady needs to be a politician to leave an impact. Some lead through policy, others through example. My mother championed anti-cyberbullying initiatives, visited hospitals, and worked to help children in need. Her Be Best campaign reached international platforms. Just because her contributions were different doesn't make them lesser. A moment of silence. Then, a single clap. It came from the back of the room. A student, a young woman with dark curls, applauded once, then twice. And suddenly, others joined in. Scattered claps turned into full applause. Professor Wright's expression tightened. He had expected an easy laugh at Melania Trump's expense. He had not expected a standing rebuttal. Barron remained composed, his face unreadable. But inside he knew this wasn't just about one professor, one insult. This was about principle, about respect, about challenging the ease with which society dismissed people based on where they came from. And as he took his seat, his heart pounded with the realization, this was only the beginning. The tension in the lecture hall lingered like a charged storm cloud. Barron Trump sat back down, his jaw tight, his pulse still racing from the confrontation. His words had been met with applause, but applause didn't erase the unease in his chest. Professor Daniel Wright cleared his throat, masking his irritation with forced amusement. All right. Let's not turn this into a political rally, he said, waving a dismissive hand. Moving on. But the students weren't moving on. In the row behind Barron, James Carter, a fellow freshman, leaned forward. He was a sharp-minded political science major from Texas, known for his bold opinions. Dude, that was insane, he whispered. I swear, I've never seen anyone shut him down like that. You actually got people clapping. Next to him, Sophia Ramirez, a law student with a reputation for speaking her mind, nodded. He's been making those kinds of remarks forever, she murmured. Not just about your family, about women in politics, about immigrants. No one ever calls him out. Barron exhaled slowly, absorbing their words. He had spent most of his life avoiding public scrutiny, staying in the background while the world dissected his family. But today had been different. Today, he had drawn a line. Still, a nagging question lingered. Had he done the right thing? After class, Barron slung his backpack over his shoulder and stepped into the wide, echoing halls of Columbia University. The late afternoon sunlight streamed through the tall windows, but the usual tranquility of campus life felt distant. He could feel eyes on him, whispers trailing in his wake. As he turned a corner, a voice called out, "Barron!" He turned to see Professor Wright standing near his office, arms crossed. His smile was tight, more calculated than warm. "Got a minute?" Barron hesitated. He could have ignored him, walked away. But something in the professor's tone, condescending, challenging, made him stop. Stepping into the office, he closed the door behind him. Wright gestured to a chair, but Barron remained standing. The professor sighed, setting his glasses down on his desk. "You're an impressive young man," he said. "Well-spoken. Passionate. I can respect that." Barron remained silent, waiting. "But I hope you understand the optics of what happened in that lecture hall today," Wright continued, leaning forward. "You made a scene. You made me look like the villain." Barron met his gaze, unwavering. I didn't make you look like anything, sir. Your words did that. The professor's jaw twitched. Careful, Mr. Trump. You're young. There's a fine line between confidence and arrogance. Barron felt his fingers tighten into a fist at his side, but he forced himself to remain calm. And there's a fine line between challenging ideas and insulting people, he replied. If I crossed one, then so did you. Wright chuckled, shaking his head. You think you won something today? That applause? He smirked. The world isn't kind to people who push back too hard, especially people with your last name. Barron's stomach twisted, but he refused to let the words shake him. With quiet conviction, he said, Then I'll just have to push harder. By the time Barron returned to his dorm, his phone was buzzing nonstop. James Carter. Bro, you're trending on campus Twitter. Someone recorded the whole thing. Sophia Ramirez. People are talking about holding a student forum on professor bias. This could be big. Barron sat on the edge of his bed, scrolling through the clips. His confrontation with Professor Wright had already spread beyond the walls of Columbia. People were debating it online, some defending him, others calling him entitled. He exhaled, rubbing his temples. Was this what he wanted? A knock at his door pulled him from his thoughts. He opened it to find Christopher Hayes, a graduate student who worked for the university's newspaper, standing there with a notebook. Mind if I ask you a few questions? Christopher asked. People are calling this the Columbia Clash. Students are rallying behind you, but faculty, well, let's just say, not everyone's thrilled. Barron hesitated. He had spent his whole life avoiding interviews, avoiding the limelight. But this was different. This wasn't about his last name. This was about what was right. So he took a breath, straightened his shoulders, and said, Ask away. Barron Trump sat in the student cafe, his laptop open but untouched. The usual hum of voices, the clinking of coffee cups, and the scent of roasted beans should have been comforting, but his mind was elsewhere. For the past 24 hours, his life had changed. His confrontation with Professor Wright had gone viral, not just on campus, but beyond. News outlets were picking up the story, debating whether Barron had stood up for what was right or if he had simply used his name to challenge authority. Some political commentators mocked him, saying he was just another privileged kid playing the victim. Others, however, admired his courage, calling him a symbol of a new generation that refused to stay silent in the face of disrespect. Barron never wanted this kind of attention. But now that he had it, he had a choice to make. Did he step back and let the storm pass? Or did he step forward and take a stand? A chair scraped against the floor as Sophia Ramirez and James Carter sat down across from him. You saw the university's statement? Sophia asked, sliding her phone toward him. Barron's eyes flicked to the screen. Columbia University responds to viral classroom debate. While we support an open exchange of ideas, we believe that healthy discourse should remain respectful and constructive. Our faculty are highly regarded professionals, and we trust in their ability to foster an engaging learning environment. Barron clenched his jaw. Nowhere in the statement did the university acknowledge Wright's inappropriate comment. They're protecting him, James muttered. Like always. Sophia leaned forward. Barron, students are organizing a forum. They want to talk about faculty accountability, about respect, about bias. And they want you to speak. Barron inhaled sharply. You want me to get up in front of the whole school and what? Call out Wright again? No, Sophia said. We want you to lead. To say what needs to be said. To stand for something bigger than just one argument in a lecture hall. Barron's hands curled into fists. He had spent his life watching his father command rooms with his voice, his mother hold her silence with dignity. He had learned that power could be wielded in different ways. But now, it was his turn to choose. The university auditorium was packed. Hundreds of students filled the seats, murmuring in anticipation. News cameras from student media outlets lined the back of the room, ready to capture whatever happened next. Barron sat backstage, heart pounding. He had never given a speech like this before. Would they listen to him? Would his words even matter? A hand touched his shoulder. It was Christopher Hayes, the student journalist who had first interviewed him. You've got their attention, Barron, he said. Now make it count. Barron exhaled, nodded, and stepped onto the stage. The murmurs died down as he approached the podium. He could see Sophia and James in the front row, nodding in encouragement. Somewhere near the back, he spotted Professor Wright, arms crossed, his face unreadable. Barron gripped the edges of the podium. The microphone buzzed softly as he leaned in. For a long moment he said nothing. Then finally he spoke. "I never wanted to be in this position," he began, his voice steady but firm. "I never wanted to be trending on social media, or to be the subject of a national debate. But I also never thought I'd sit in a classroom where an educator, the person entrusted to challenge us, to inspire us, would use his position to tear someone down instead." A hushed silence spread through the crowd. "This isn't about me. This isn't even about my mother." Barron's eyes swept over the audience. "This is about a culture where we think it's okay to ridicule someone because of their accent, their background, or how they got to where they are." He took a breath, letting his words sink in. When we mock someone's intelligence because they weren't born here, we don't just insult them, we insult everyone who's ever struggled to belong. Every student who had to work twice as hard because English wasn't their first language. Every immigrant who dared to dream that they could be something more. A ripple of quiet agreement moved through the crowd. Barron's voice grew stronger. "And when we stay silent in the face of that kind of disrespect, we become part of the problem." He paused, then looked toward Professor Wright. "You told me yesterday that the world isn't kind to people who push back. But I think the real danger isn't in speaking up, it's in being too afraid to." A single clap rang out. Then another. And another. Suddenly, the entire room erupted in applause. Barron let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. He had spoken his truth. And they had heard him. For the first time in his life, Barron wasn't standing in the shadow of his last name. He was standing on his own. And he was just getting started. The thunderous applause echoed in Barron's ears as he stepped away from the podium. His chest rose and fell with deep breaths, his hands still tingling from the adrenaline. He had done it. He had spoken his truth. But as the claps slowly faded and students stood murmuring amongst themselves, Barron knew this wasn't the end. This was just the beginning. As Barron made his way off the stage, he was immediately surrounded. "Man, that was powerful," James Carter said, clapping him on the back. Sophia Ramirez grinned. "You just did something that no one else had the guts to do." Students lined up to shake his hand, some even asking for photos. But it wasn't about the recognition, it was about what they were saying. "Thank you for speaking up. That professor's been making comments like that for years. No one ever pushed back. I'm an immigrant, and hearing you say what you said, it meant something." Each voice, each person, solidified a truth Barron had only just begun to grasp. His words had weight. And they had made an impact. But not everyone was pleased. As the crowd thinned, Barron caught sight of Professor Wright standing near the exit, his arms crossed. Their eyes met. For a long moment, neither spoke. Then, Wright gave a small, calculated smirk. "Impressive performance, Mr. Trump." His voice was low, edged with something unreadable. "But let's see how long the applause lasts." He turned and walked out before Barron could respond. Barron's jaw tightened, but he let out a breath. He knew this wasn't over. People like Wright didn't back down easily. But neither would he. The next morning, Barron's speech was everywhere. News outlets picked it up. Major headlines read, "Barron Trump confronts bias in academia." Columbia student sparks campus debate on faculty ethics. Social media was divided. Some praised him, calling him brave and principled. Others accused him of grandstanding, playing the victim. But what mattered most was that the university was forced to respond. Later that day, an email from Columbia's administration hit every student's inbox. "We recognize the importance of maintaining an inclusive and respectful academic environment. We are committed to reviewing our policies on faculty conduct to ensure that all students feel heard and valued in the classroom." It wasn't a full admission of wrongdoing, but it was something. A shift. A sign that things were changing. And then came the biggest shock. Barron received an email from the Office of Student Affairs requesting a formal meeting. "Looks like they want to talk," he told Sophia and James, showing them the email. "They're probably scared you'll push this even further," Sophia said. "Maybe I will," Barron mused, a thoughtful look in his eyes. For the first time, he wasn't just reacting. He was taking control. That night, Barron sat in his dorm room, staring out the window at the New York skyline. The city stretched endlessly before him, lights flickering like a million possibilities. He picked up his phone and dialed a familiar number. "Mama?" he said when the call connected. Melania Trump's soft, accented voice came through. "Hello, Barron. How are you?" Barron hesitated, then smiled slightly. "I spoke up today," he admitted. "About you. About respect." There was a pause. Then, a quiet warmth in her voice. "I am proud of you. Always." Barron felt his chest tighten, a deep sense of validation washing over him. For so long, he had been the quiet one, the observer, the son of a giant shadow. But now, he had found his own voice. And he wasn't afraid to use it. The days following the forum were a whirlwind. Barron was approached by student leaders, journalists, even faculty members who had seen his speech. Some expressed their support privately, admitting they had long been frustrated with the unspoken bias and disrespect that often went unchecked. Others, however, remained skeptical, seeing him as a privileged voice using his name to push an agenda. But despite the debates, one thing was undeniable: change had been set in motion. The university announced a review of faculty conduct policies, and students began organizing discussions about classroom ethics and respect. The administration even introduced an anonymous reporting system for students to voice concerns about professors who crossed the line. As for Professor Wright, the controversy forced the university to take a closer look at his record. Though he wasn't fired, he was placed under formal review. His classes were closely monitored, and for the first time in years, he was held accountable. Barron had done something few had managed to do. He had forced an institution to listen. 1 week after the forum, Barron found himself standing on the steps of Columbia University's main hall, looking out over the bustling campus. The world around him felt the same. Students rushing between classes, the scent of coffee drifting from nearby cafes, the sound of taxis honking in the distance. But inside, he felt different. Sophia and James stood beside him, talking about the next steps, how they could keep the conversation going, push for more student involvement, maybe even start a movement for academic fairness. Barron listened, a small smile playing at his lips. For years, he had been hesitant to step into the spotlight, always wary of being defined by his last name. But now, he understood something his mother had taught him all along: respect isn't something given, it's something earned. And sometimes, earning respect meant standing up when no one else would. That night, Barron sat down at his desk and opened his laptop. His inbox was flooded with messages. From students, from professors, even from people outside the university who had seen the video of his speech. Some were messages of support. Others were challenges, criticisms, even threats. But one email stood out. It was from a first-generation college student, a young woman named Layla whose parents had immigrated from Lebanon. She wrote, "Barron, I don't know if you'll read this, but I just wanted to say thank you. I've spent my whole life being told I wasn't smart enough because of my accent. Your speech made me feel seen. It made me feel like maybe I do belong here. So, thank you for speaking up when so many of us were too afraid to." Barron sat back in his chair, reading the message again. And in that moment, he realized this had never been just about one classroom, one professor, or even just about him. It was about something bigger. It was about all the people who had been mocked, belittled, or dismissed, people who had stayed silent because they thought their voice didn't matter. But voices did matter. Words had power. And when used for the right reasons, they could change lives. Barron closed his laptop, exhaled deeply, and stared out at the city skyline. This wasn't the end. It was only the beginning. Because the next time someone tried to use their power to humiliate, belittle, or silence someone else, they wouldn't just be facing one student. They'd be facing a movement. And that movement had only just begun. Speak when it's difficult. Stand when it's uncomfortable. Because the moment you choose silence in the face of injustice, you've chosen the side of the oppressor.